detach from the substrate and make its way to the surface. And this is mid-lake Pigeon Lake. This is not a shoreline bloom here. This is mid-lake. You are now all familiar with how big Pigeon Lake is. So generally, I mean, most people in Alberta that are familiar with blooms, we avoid the shoreline areas, get in our boats, go out to the middle of the lake and do our activities. This is what you're met with in 2006 in the middle of Pigeon Lake. Big raft of cyanobacteria. Not that it's a toxin-producing species, but Lingia is associated with skin irritation with direct contact. Also, what's notable about cyanobacteria that make them really the best competitor in the phytoplankton community of our lakes is they have superior uptake of inorganic carbon sources. Most of those other groups I showed you need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Well, being highly evolved, cyanobacteria can utilize bicarbonate and carbonate as an inorganic carbon source. And if you understand the chemistry of lakes, as pH of a lake goes up, the primary source of inorganic carbon shifts from carbon dioxide to bicarbonate. Therefore, a competitive advantage to cyanobacteria over all those other groups that really need CO2. So our lakes, and I'll touch on that in a second, high pH lakes, bicarbonate is more of a predominant form of inorganic carbon. So great competitive advantage to the cyanobacteria. Buoyancy regulation. This is a part of that Gliotrichia bloom that was photographed by the airplane from the Edmonton Journal. This is the front of it. And you can see, it's an orange pigmented species here in the surface, non-toxic, but it is associated with severe skin irritation in people recreating in it. It controls buoyancy, as do other species of cyanobacteria, meaning that it can regulate its position in the water column. So it can get to the ideal level of nutrients, perhaps, or more importantly, of sunlight. The sunlight, the form of sunlight is very important. The spectrum of light is very important for maximum photosynthetic rate. And as a photosynthetic organism, you want to be at maximum photosynthetic rate because that translates into greater growth. A number of species also fix atmospheric nitrogen. So a number of species like Anabina here do possess specialized cells that can take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into a source that can be used by the cell. And that is critical because most of those other groups we see do not fix atmospheric nitrogen. So when we have an abundance of phosphorus in a lake, so we're not limited by phosphorus in some of our lakes, we can become limited by nitrogen. But here cyanobacteria comes along, certain species, and they're going to pull atmospheric nitrogen, which is always available. It's going to pull it into the lake system and actually outcompete all those other groups of harmless algae in terms of growth, because those other groups can't fix nitrogen. So, competitive in terms of chemistry of lakes. Form, the other last issue is many species, as you can see here, form large colonies. These are all little small cells of 5 microns, but we get this large colony that's 250 microns or larger in size. Microcystis being a primary example. Here's Anabina who has a chain in a colony. These species produce a thick mucilage around, which makes them kind of resistant to digestion by organisms. My PhD was studying snails and the effect of microcystis and the toxin microcystin on snails, and I found out through my PhD research that snails do ingest, because they graze indiscriminately, they will ingest cyanobacteria, but they can't digest it, it passes through. But there is some limited amount that will digest small fragments, but for the most part, most organisms will not digest large colonial cyanobacteria. So all the grazers in there do not prefer cyanobacteria. They will rather go around and eat all those other choice bits of diatoms, of green algae, and of other species that are far better for them, far easier to digest. So these are left in the lake. So even the little organisms that eat algae in the lake are leaving this behind and taking the good stuff out, leaving the bad stuff in. So highly evolved, in other words, the cyanobacteria over other groups. So unfortunately, again, this is a scenario in Alberta lakes. Pigeon Lake was 6. This is, I think, Gregoire Lake up by Fort Mac, shoreline blue. Characteristics of our lakes, I already touched on this, but just in general terms, and Pigeon Lake is lumped in the generalities here. Majority of lakes, as we've seen from the presentation by Jay, and Chris touched on some aspects, majority of lakes in Alberta reside in this carbonate and nutrient-rich glacial till basins, very thick till nutrient. So our lakes are naturally elevated in pH, in alkalinity, in phosphorus concentrations, and I touched on many of them are that low N to P ratio. Now we have plenty of phosphorus, and if we look at the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus, we get into that moderate nitrogen to phosphorus ratio of less than 30, often less than 20, sometimes less than 5. Less than 5, we get into a nitrogen limited condition. And again, a species of cyanobacteria that can fix atmospheric nitrogen are not going to be limited by nitrogen. Many, again, we touched on this, Pigeon Lake's a prime example. Many of our lakes are shallow and they're polymictic. They mix intermittently, weakly stratified, but that, again, sets up that scenario for over and over internal loading throughout the open water season. It's somewhat can be ongoing. Some of our deeper lakes, of course, will stratify. Intense development of watersheds, I don't have to go into too much detail about that. I think we all can appreciate the effect of agriculture and urban development on lakes, any kind of development, and industrial, some industrial in there as well, logging activities. Intense development is going to exacerbate the flow of nutrients to the system. And Chris also touched on the long water retention time. Many of the lakes are in excess of 100 years, as Pigeon Lake is. And of course, that's going to have implications for what we do to the lake in terms of treatment. So once phosphorus gets in, it stays in for a long time. This is just, in Alberta, we use the number 800 lakes in the province, 800 major lakes. So really, we're challenged for surface water in the province of Alberta compared to other provinces like Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. They have thousands, tens of thousands of lakes. We have relatively few lakes in the province. And for a Canadian province, we are getting a larger population, and those people will have the income to spend time on lakes. This is a chart showing from our departmental database on lakes from the last 30 years. Total, in this case, of 465 lake basins. And you can see just a general alkalinity. We're on the alkaline side. We have some highly alkaline lakes. Again, that speaks to the water chemistry and the carbon issue there. pH, same thing. Our lakes are on the generally over pH 8 to 9, majority of our lakes. So another, let's say 465 lakes, so pH is high. Again, that speaks to that carbon issue that cyanobacteria can use bicarbonate versus those other species that need carbon dioxide. These are going to be bicarbonate dominated lakes, not CO2. Carbon dioxide would increase as we go this way. So again, importance for the competitive advantage to cyanobacteria. And maximum depth of our lakes. This is 259 lake basins that we had data for in our database. We have many shallow lakes, many shallow prairie lakes. We have shallow lakes in the north of the province in the boreal region. Again, implications for that continual mixing and internal loading of phosphorus from the sediments. So we really have a shortage of nice deep lakes in this province. This is 250 lakes, I believe, in this chart. I know many of you have seen this before, and this is just an updated one from this past year. It doesn't change much year to year. This is total phosphorus concentration of lakes versus the trophic, different categories for trophic status. And you can see that majority of lakes in this data set are in the eutrophic to hypereutrophic range in terms of total phosphorus, naturally so. We do have a few gems. These tend to be in that foothills region and upper alpine area, but we do have some good quality lakes in the province as well. These are the mesotrophic lakes. This would be the clear water lakes like Sylvan Lake, for instance. And again, this is more of the provincial data set of phosphorus, log phosphorus on the bottom, on the X, and chlorophyll response. Now, it's pretty much a linear relationship. We do have saline lakes in the province that have plenty of phosphorus, but in saline lakes, you can have the phosphorus, but cyanobacteria and algae are limited by other micronutrients, so we don't see that show as high chlorophyll, as high biomass of algae. They are restricted in saline lakes like Miquelon Lake, highly saline lake, plenty of phosphorus, but it doesn't result in algal growth. but you don't want to say Land Lake either, because it's just not a pleasant environment, especially to swim in. Not the ones in Alberta anyway. And this, of course, is just the same graph now showing the chlorophyll distribution. So our estimate of overall algal biomass, which encompasses cyanobacteria and all those other groups. And we can see that again, most of our lakes are green water lakes.
Those, across the bottom, we're seeing all the same lakes. I mean,
In those two graphs, we're the same lakes, yeah.
Trophic in, basically what you're saying is that the nutrient concentration
Translates to this. Absolutely. And you can't read this, but I mean, we do have these maps or these graphs available that you can read from our department. One thing we can say that in terms of water quality across the province, you can only make, I think, one generalization. We do get our oligotrophic, our more pristine, low nutrient systems do occur more, I guess broadly, in the alpine foothills and mountain region of the province. So this is phosphorus, this is chlorophyll. Outside of that, or I will make one other exception, down here in southern Alberta, most of these are reservoirs, they're not natural lakes, so they tend to have better water quality because it's Bow River water from the mountains. So these are not natural lakes. But as we go through the province, we can see that, you know, we have mesotrophic lakes nearby, immediately adjacent to hypereutrophic and to eutrophic lakes. You have to really consider each lake as its own specific entity and have a good understanding of the limnology of that system that you're concerned with. Because there's a number of factors, physical factors, you know, climate and other things. There's so many factors that translate into the quality of a lake that have to be considered. But generally, I mean, we can't say that, you know, the south is better water quality, north is bad. I mean, we have eutrophic, mesotrophic, and hypereutrophic dispersed throughout the province. We don't have a lot of data up here. There are lakes up here, less lakes up in the northwest, but we do have a lot of lakes up here that we just don't have data for. And we're trying to deal with that. So in terms of the species, relative species of the phytoplankton community, so this is the overall broad algae community, including cyanobacteria, all these major groupings. Chris showed one for Pigeon Lake with his lines. I'm showing this as an area graph considering 100% of the community. And we can see in a oligomesotrophic lake, so a lower productivity lake up by Athabasca, has a very small cyanobacteria community. And I can tell you, because this is data from my PhD thesis back in 1995, that this cyanobacteria was not a surface blooming cyanobacteria in this particular lake. This is actually a metalimnetic species that lives way deep down. This is Planktothrix. So cyanobacteria lives in all of our lakes, just not necessarily creating those surface blooms. But you can see, very diverse community. We have all these groups are represented. Cyanobacteria is a minor constituent in a cleaner water lake. So like a Sylvan Lake, we would have less, maybe a bit more cyanobacteria, but low. It's not a predominant species or group. Contrast that to Baptiste Lake, which is only about 30 kilometers away. So I said you got to consider lakes independently. Baptiste Lake is a moderately sized lake, but it has a massive watershed. Massive watershed flowing in. It has a very short water retention time, but the watershed's so large, natural inflow of nutrients, this lake is green. And you can see how dominant cyanobacteria come starting in about June, and it takes off and dominates that the surface water of that lake. So this is this you can generalize and expect to see. If you know the trophic status of the lake, you can have an expectation that the community would look like cyanobacteria dominated if it's of similar trophic status. Worst scenario, another even worse condition would be Nakvin Lake, just northwest of here. I know most of you are familiar with Nakvin Lake. And again, this is a shallow, highly eutrophic system, and cyanobacteria just take over that lake right from just shortly after ice out and stays around for a long time. Diatoms are there early on and later. And Chris touched on paleolimnology. These diatoms are important because they do produce a silica skeleton, which will deposit on the sediment and stack up in the sediments over time and we identified these skeletons to look at historically what we can look at what species are laid down in the sediment and translate or backcast what the water quality may have been, because some species of diatoms prefer nutrient-rich conditions over other species. So that's how we use the sediment. So pretty much we have a good understanding now that cyanobacteria are highly adapted to certain water quality conditions. Alberta lakes just happen to have those certain water quality conditions. So this is the reality for us. No, this isn't Pigeon Lake. This is Steel Lake. Steel Lake is a small lake with another lake with a massive watershed. And this, very little development and very little agriculture in this watershed. But you can see natural conditions in this lake because of nutrients naturally coming in from a large watershed contribute to high phosphorus concentrations in that lake. That's up by the northwest one. This is again the Lingbia from Pigeon Lake in 06. Massive maps of it in the middle of the lake. So this is the reality for us through much of the central portion and well into the north of the province. Now, I just want to touch one slide on kind of, we talk about blooms. I want to kind of make sure we have a good understanding of what blooms are and what blooms aren't. Blooms are not just a rapid growth of cyanobacteria. Blooms can happen overnight. When we talk about a surface accumulation, it can appear to happen overnight. It's not because of rapid growth. It's because of certain water quality, physical conditions in a lake that causes all the cyanobacteria to rise to the surface. What these conditions are, or what we need in terms of a surface bloom formation to occur, we need an abundance of existing cells or colonies already in the water column. And you can see these particles in the water column dispersed. We have our upper lit, sunlit, eutrophic, euphotic zone, and then we have our darker underlying water. Of course, photosynthetic organisms, they need the sun, they need to live up in here. Well, when we get conditions of lake circulation due to wind, represented in my nice animated slide, what that causes is the cyanobacteria are basically at the whim of that current. So it's brought up into the sunlit layers and down into dark sun, dark sun, dark. That can stimulate cyanobacteria to produce the gas vesicles, or vacuoles. Those vacuoles make the cyanobacteria positively buoyant, like hot air balloons, to try to keep them up in the sunlit layer. Well, unfortunately, when that wind stops and we get that calm period that ensues immediately after a week of wind, and generally it's like a week of windy conditions that sets this off. We get calm conditions prevailing, and then we get this en masse migration of cyanobacteria to the surface. So we didn't notice it when it was all well distributed in the water column, although it does impart a green color, but when it all rises to the surface during calm conditions following wind, then we get our surface bloom. And as you guys very well know, in some situations, like Pigeon Lake in 06, when that bloom hit the surface, it stayed the whole season. And why it stays the whole season is because once it's at this point, once it's near the surface, it becomes, the cells of the cyanobacteria actually get inhibited by high sunlight intensity. So it no longer can down-regulate its buoyancy and sink down in the water column. It's stuck at the surface, and it's going to die there. And it's going to release toxin there if it's a toxin producer. And it's going to be there for you to see. That's what happened in 06 in Pigeon Lake. Just the conditions were right to cause that to come to the surface, and it stayed around a long time. In healthy lakes, in less dysfunctional systems, I'll say, you get a daily migration of cyanobacteria up and down. If we're not at the tipping point where we have a super large, these really big communities of cyanobacteria, you will see cyanobacteria up near the surface, near shore, in the morning hours when sunlight intensity is low, because it needs a certain amount of sunlight intensity. You'll see it at the surface. Come back at noon when the intensity of sunlight is high, it disappears. It actually goes back down. That is a normal functioning lake with cyanobacteria. However, as we know, many of our lakes are more on the dysfunctional state in terms of cyanobacteria, and it gets to the surface and it's stuck. It's not going anywhere. Quick slide on factors influencing bloom appearance. Of course, there's a number of species. Here's the Gliatrichia, that was photographed from the air. It's these little round orangey spheres. Again, non-toxic, but it does cause severe skin irritation in a certain subset of the population. Some people are really susceptible to it, others are not. Anabena is the green particle, so we have to look at colony morphology and pigmentation. These are the photosynthetic pigments I'm referring to. We have to look at degree of accumulation and aggregation. Here's this is Pigeon Lake in 06, real light, wispy, mild, well, there's quite a bit of biomass there, but it's not a thick, muddy bloom. Here's that mid-lake Lingbia anabena dominated bloom in the mat. So how much accumulation or aggregation of the colonies. We have degree of dispersion after, so we get this uniform mat, and then we get more winds coming up, breaking it apart. Again, mid-Pigeon Lake, and this is a different lake, a Phantasonian bloom that's already being dispersed, broken up. And then we have life cycle stage. Dark green pigment, the more rich pigment color is really showing a healthier state of the cells of that species or species. However, again, once we're stranded at the surface, high sunlight intensity will start photo bleaching the cells. The cells will die off, and they're going to remain there, and it's going to degrade. And then this is Pigeon Lake shoreline at the provincial beach in boat launch in 06, and we can see the purple pigment already coming out of cells that are dying. That's photosynthetic pigment within the cells coming out. And then this is Steel Lake from way back, and you can see there was a white encrusted layer already on the surface. That's already dead cells. It's just completely photo bleached. And again, a couple more stage and rate of decomposition. Pigeon Lake in 06, decomposing Lingbia anabena, and this is just a typical of what we see with the Phantasonian near a reed bed. I think this is Coal Lake, Pyrocasquin, and we can see pigment and photo bleaching as well. We're going to touch on this because we think that, again, there's that kind of misnomer that the clean water lakes don't have any cyanobacteria. Well, we do. Cyanobacteria exist everywhere, and here's the scenario. Planktothrix does come up, and I showed you some data from Narrow Lake with Planktothrix being a bit of a part of the community. Planktothrix is an interesting species because it requires really low sunlight intensity. It does not live in the real high light intensity near the surface. It lives deeper down near what we call the metalimnium. Requires a low special spectrum of light, and so these tend not to form surface blooms, but they do live in the oligotrophic and mesotrophic systems. So we know we have Planktothrix in many of our lakes. Planktothrix does aggregate at depth, so it uses its buoyancy regulation not to go to the surface, but to go to that ideal layer of light intensity and spectrum. So we do get a distinct band of Planktothrix deep down in these lakes midsummer. And this is sporadic, they come and go. Interesting thing about, or the most, I guess, problematic issue with Planktothrix is it produces a high level of microcystin toxin. So it's a problem. Not a problem for people swimming up here, but it's a problem for our drinking water utilities because toxin can still be in our cleaner water lakes. No, the toxin levels per liter don't get as high as they do in some of the surface blooming lakes, but we do get microcystin in those more what you would call a pristine water lake environment. We still get microcystin toxin produced. And the area where we really see Planktothrix becoming an issue for us is wintertime. Under ice, when we have no snow cover, enough sunlight will penetrate the ice where Planktothrix will come off the sediment and grow under the ice. And then upon ice out conditions in spring, as soon as the ice comes out, this is Planktothrix. As soon as the ice goes out, we get Planktothrix in the surface water. These are short-lived blooms of Planktothrix because, again, high light intensity now with the ice being off will kill this rapidly, but these are toxic blooms. This is Skeleton Lake back several years ago. This is by Spruce Meadows, south of Calgary, on the south end of Calgary, and then just in a roadside pond. And then Fleeing Horse Lake out by the southeast of Stepan. That was not a recreational lake, it's a storm, I think it's a pond for the sewage pond there. So Planktothrix is an issue. Be aware of that. Planktothrix, also, this was probably, in my 20 years of studying cyanobacteria, this is probably one of the most interesting things that has happened. We had planktothrix bloom under the ice as the lake was freezing in November. Subsequently, that ice was toxic all winter long. Had a high amount of 50 micrograms per liter in this core of ice, 50 micrograms per liter of microcystin toxin. And this is how the lake froze up. I mean, it's freezing at the surface, and we had planktothrix causing, basically coming up and causing these strata of cyanobacteria in the ice as the lake was freezing. Very unique conditions. So understand the challenges in terms of what, cyanobacteria in different environments.
Hey Ron, how common is that?
It's the only time I've seen it in 20 years, so.
Okay, because they
It's
called
not
us
common.
and we called you, so.
The under ice in spring,
Yeah.
we get probably 2 to 3 reports every spring now. But usually they're not major recreational lakes, although that one year was North Basin of Skeleton Lake. Usually it's in these smaller waters where we see planktothrix blooming under the ice in spring, and then we see the bloom as the ice comes off. Talking a bit about toxins as I move through here, cyanobacterial toxins. The gold species of cyanobacteria here are common inhabitants of our lakes in Alberta. Microcystin, very common Anabaena planktothrix, are known microcystin producers. Microcystin is bold here because it's one of the most prevalent toxins. From our research, it's the most prevalent toxin in Alberta. We do get anatoxins showing up periodically. It's associated with certain species of Anabaena planktothrix. In other countries, it's associated with phantozomin, which is very common here, but we don't see that occurring in our lakes, toxic phantozomin. We did a couple years of saxitoxin, which is paralytic shellfish poison, produced by a number of species. Never found it in our lakes in Alberta. And we also looked at 2 years of cylindrospermopsin, which is common in the U.S., and migrating, the species cylindrospermopsis is migrating northward from Florida on up. It's in Ontario, I believe. I think Mark has a bit of data showing cylindrospermopsis.
Moose Lake from 2000.
Moose Lake, that's the first time in Alberta we've seen cylindrospermopsis. And again, I think it requires a bit warmer conditions, and hopefully we don't get those warm conditions. But we have never found the cylindrospermopsin toxin, which is good news for us. But again, Moose Lake, have to look at that water. You probably could do the analysis and how to sample that. Anyway, I also mentioned that dermatotoxins, the skin irritation is just a general issue with cyanobacteria due to the production of these particular lipopolysaccharides on the exterior of the cells that some subset of the human population are susceptible to. So we're looking at a myriad of compounds produced by cyanobacteria, but recognizing they're bacteria, we shouldn't be surprised because we know bacteria can kill us. The big, again, concerns, dermatotoxins, we're looking at skin irritation, red eyes. I know people that go in the water in some of our lakes and they'll come out with their eyes looking like this. A buddy of mine does that. I don't have any issue with it. I can go in, I don't come up with red eyes. Pigeon Lake in 06, we did get reports of severe skin irritation in Pigeon Lake in 06. And it's severe in some people. In fact, there's some people from our department that have their families there, and their families ended up getting severe skin irritation. Neurotoxins I touched on are sporadic, short-lived, but they are in Alberta associated with waterfowl mortality, very sporadic. Again, the big issue for us is the microcystin liver toxins. Here's normal mouse liver, and here's mouse liver on microcystin. Causes mass hemorrhaging of the liver at a high dose. So big concerns for us. For us meaning the Government of Alberta in general. So I'm going to just touch on managing the risks to cyanotoxins. First and foremost, Health Canada came up with a drinking water guideline in 2001. The Department of Environment at the time adopted the drinking water guideline for the regulated drinking water treatment facilities. Guideline was microcystin, 1.5 micrograms per liter of microcystin. I joined the department shortly after. I criticized Health Canada for using a microcystin LR guideline. That's one toxin of a family of over 70 toxins. Microcystin is a family of toxins, not just one compound. Subsequent to that, we now have revised the drinking water guideline in Alberta and with Health Canada to incorporate total microcystin in drinking water. We've got to look at the overall load of toxin, not just one toxin compound. toxic compound. And more recently, we're dealing with, Health Canada came up with the Recreational Water Quality Guidelines for use in Canada. Alberta Department of Health has adopted the guideline at that time in use, and of course, you know the beach monitoring program. I'll talk about that in a second. In Alberta, we have two guidelines for recreational water. We have the total microcystin guideline of 20 micrograms per liter, and we have a total cyanobacteria guideline. And this total cyanobacteria guideline doesn't really speak to the toxicity issue. It speaks to that contact recreation causing the skin irritation. How the Department of Health and how Alberta Health Services that conducts the work, how they are using this information, they will employ both guidelines in the beach monitoring program in determining the beaches to post with health advisories, or they are looking at simple, visiting the beach and just looking at how extensive the bloom is. So they're basically a very subjective call by their staff going out and looking at a beach line area. If they see a surface accumulation, they can start the ball rolling on the health risk advisory. Two aspects to monitoring cyanobacteria and toxins in the province. Okay, we have the Alberta Beach Monitoring Program. This was initiated in 2010. They initially looked at the Department of Environment's water quality data set on microcystins, and then came up with the candidate beaches that they were going to monitor on a weekly basis. This program coincides with fecal coliform and E. coli monitoring as well on the beaches, which has been in practice for quite some time already. Again, visual monitoring for blue-green algae. They conduct microcystin analysis, and with people like Mark's group at the U of A conducting the rapid assessment of species and counts for cyanobacteria, we can then assess the cyanobacteria cells per mil guideline. And the program also generates some of the sampling required for some of our other ongoing research. You're aware of this. I know Pigeon Lake are definitely aware of this and really probably hate this. And I can't disagree with you because it's still an imperfect system. I'll tell you now, the beach monitoring program under Department of Health and Alberta Health Services is still a work in progress. Things are going to change, okay? I am a proponent of having public information signage everywhere where there's an issue of blooms, persistent blooms. I will once again state, reiterate, it's not a lake closure when there's an advisory. It's purely a public health advisory for the benefit of Albertans or people using that water body, is to educate them. It still comes down to the individual to make the call on whether or not they're going to use that water body for recreational purposes. And I know, obviously, I think you get the idea that it really comes down to the density of cyanobacteria that translates to risk to human health. We're trying to make this assessment less subjective. We're now assessing more rapid in situ technologies for determining the amount of biomass in the water in situ or on site. Rapid assessment, I think, is required because blooms come and go and intensities change continuously. And I know you guys don't want to see an advisory come in and last the whole season. I can totally understand that. So we are addressing that. Our department is evaluating some in situ technologies, portable technologies, so it's less subjective. Because I'm not confident in Alberta Health Services going out and making the call on what a bloom or how bad a bloom is. Because I know they're not well trained enough. So you need the objective means to measure and make a call in terms of how bad a bloom is to warrant the public advisory. So again, things are going to change. I can tell you that now. So it's not all doom and gloom. Not yet. This is 2013 beach advisories. We had 36 public health advisories across the province. For the majority, it's in the northern portion of the province. These are all occurring in eutrophic lakes with histories of blooms. The issue for us down in Calgary, we did have an issue around the Calgary region last year, And this speaks to kind of what Jay and Chris talked about, diffuse flows and everything else. I said earlier that in Calgary region, we have very few natural lakes. Many of these are reservoirs. Many of these don't typically get surface bloom. However, with the massive flooding we had in the southern region last summer, that caused a lot of diffuse flow and channelized flow of nutrients to these reservoirs. What's important for cyanobacteria growth? If the phosphorus isn't coming out of the sediment, but does come from diffuse flow or from the watershed, available phosphorus in the surface water is going to cause a response in that lake in terms of the phytoplankton community. You're going to get a rapid response in terms of growth of cyanobacteria with available phosphorus in the surface water. So it's critical to consider that external inputs. And that external inputs are going to vary year to year with surface runoff. So 2006 in Pigeon Lake, while it wasn't that 06 was not particularly bad province-wide in other lakes. In fact, 07 was worse. Pigeon Lake had, in my view, there was an issue of nutrient inflow to Pigeon Lake in 06. Whether that was a period of a few years of low runoff and then all of a sudden a really wet year causing diffuse, runoff to come off the ag fields and other development into Pigeon Lake. Whatever happened to Pigeon Lake, there was available phosphorus and the lake responded by a really odd severe bloom occurring in that year. Just a side note, for the advisories this past year, most of the advisories for public health result from exceeding the cells per mil of cyanobacteria guideline or the density of a blues high. Very rarely do those advisories come about from high microcystin concentrations exceeding 20 micrograms per liter. It does happen periodically. Touch on the fish issue because this also